This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really delighted to speak with Michael Alexander today, who is a professor of religious studies at the University of California, Riverside, where he holds the Maimonides Chair in Jewish Studies. Michael is the author of Jazz Age Jews, which won a National Jewish Book Award, and Making Peace with the Universe, Personal Crisis and Spiritual Healing. So, Michael, there is a gap between these two books, as there is for most of us academics who have to do other things besides writing books. So I'm wondering what was going on for you creatively and academically after Jazz Age Jews?
Well, this is some folks just write their second and their third and their fourth, and they're great at pumping out material. I'm not. So I took a little time, and I churned through a couple of projects that didn't work out. So, typically what happens, I'm sure you've seen this in your experience as well, is that there's when you move into the teaching position and you're sort of forced to face new classes, it changes what some of your interests may be. It broadens it. And you now have some time in front of a classroom having to explain yourself at a simpler level. Or a more abstracted level. And so I got my first position at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm in Jewish Studies, and was more or less assigned by my boss to teach a class on the state of Israel. And so I became more interested in doing research there for the classroom, and came up with a project that I thought would be good for a book, which was a kind of dual biography of Golda Meir and Henry Kissinger leading up to the Yom Kippur War and their interactions at that point in time. And it was going to be a kind of study of Jews holding state power, which is a fairly new phenomenon, since 1948, essentially.
Sounds like a great topic to me.
Yeah, it was good, and I learned a lot, and I think it really has informed my teaching because I learned so much from doing it. But at some point, I recognized that I was not capable or interested of gaining the expertise necessary to do it. That it was the world of policy wonks, and that I was not a policy wonk, and I was not going to ever be one, and that it was almost good. It was good enough for it to inform my teaching, but not necessarily inform my publishing life. Although there's an article or two here or there, but a book project is a special thing. A book project is really putting a good chunk of your time into really saying something substantial. Not that some people are great article writers, but I'm not. I spin them off of a larger project. So that came and went, and that was, 7 or 8 years of looking into a project that didn't really pan out. But the first book, Jazz Age Jews, was in the form of a prosopography, multiple biographies in order to tell a particular period of time or tell of a generation. And I became interested, or I sort of started to develop that as the structure that I enjoyed. So I had gone from 3 cases in Jazz Age Jews to what was going to become basically 2 cases in this Golda Meir Henry Kissinger book. So I continued to play around with that idea of having a lead character or some lead characters that to structure stories. And it very much led to the book that became the second book.
Thanks for explaining this behind the scenes part that I think often remains so invisible to people, that we come up with ideas, invest time and research money even into them, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to pursue them to the end, of it being published as a book. So I think that is really common and helpful to hear. So the second book, which is pretty recent, is very different. Can you tell our listeners where this one came from?
Yeah, I mean, I threw a lot of spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks and what doesn't. I had come into religious studies, I think, initially with more classically spiritual kinds of questions. And through the process of going to graduate school, came out with a project that was more historical cultural about Jazz Age Jews was it was about Al Jolson and the making of the jazz singer. And although there were religious elements to that whole story, it's about a movie, or a part of it was about a movie. And so, in a sense, I had kind of wandered from the original curiosities that had instigated my initial interest when I was, a freshman in college and opened up the college catalog and was treating it like it was a candy store. I kind of gravitated to classes on the Book of Genesis and classically spiritual texts and things like that. So I guess as I was contemplating a second book, I started to take those curiosities more seriously. I started to ignore the voice in my head that was like, "Oh, that's silly.
Mm.
That's not for grown-ups." And especially I mean, as you know, that having read it, the uh, the the personal element was coming to the forefront. In other words, I was asking myself, I've been in school for a long time now. I'm continuing to be in school as a faculty member. Um, what's been driving me to be in a department of religion and to be talking about these kinds of issues of religion and spirituality for so long? What's kind of the animation for it? Especially the more we learn about it, the more we recognize that often it's too often the case that religion is just the crassest justification for political goals of, racism and sexism and sexual phobia and, increasingly nationalism. So now you're standing up in front of a classroom and explaining or talking to students about this phenomenon and sort of wondering to myself, well, what is it good for?
Mm.
What does it have a saving grace, as it were? And so I went looking for it. Uh, and in this kind of moment of thinking to myself, what am I doing in front of the students, explaining these things to them, I eventually came to recognize that the great spiritual masterpieces that I had been making myself familiar with for so long were often composed by someone who was in the midst of a crisis in their own lives. And because religion was the forum for therapy before we had modern therapy, they turned, it was the place to turn when you literally didn't know the next step to take forward. They did so. And in fact, because they were spiritual geniuses, they managed to it worked for them. It worked therapeutically for them. And because they're spiritual geniuses, they were able to put their thoughts together on paper, or in one of the cases, in record form and music form, and were able to bring forward with themselves a whole tradition by the personal insights that they had gained by their own spiritual curiosity. And so that became really interesting to me. And I'd always been interested in the therapeutic and religion, but I couldn't conceive of a project in which to do it.
You weave some of your own, I don't know if we would call it, I thought of it as almost memoir kind of writing, alongside these more, I guess, scholarly learning chapters. And I guess I was wondering how it was for you to write that way so personally. I don't know if you had done any of that before, or if this felt like it came natural. What was that like, writing very personally?
Well, it was um, it was part of trying to find a legitimate voice with which to tell these stories and these what I think of them as these kind of case histories of spiritual therapy, because I was not a psychologist or a psychiatrist and was unable to look at these with their analytic tools or their legitimacy with the, PhD in psychology behind my name. And so I needed a means to talk about what I was reading that was had its own legitimacy. And the only answer that I had to that was that I was reading it for myself, which was actually true because I had been reading it for myself. And so that's why I mean the great fear that I had and continue to have regarding including oneself into the manuscript, as it were, is that it's gratuitous. It's that it's not helping matters. It's not helping the reader. Um, and I haven't gotten over that. And yet when I talk to folks who've read it and and have nice things to say about it, often that's the stuff that they most identify with. So I don't know if you can ever read it as though you didn't write it yourself.
Mhm.
But those portions of it it's not that it was the most difficult to write, like it was, wrenching or something to write it, but it was more wrenching to sort of put it out there. That said, I was pretty scrupulous about it's not graphic. There's nothing in particular that is it's not lurid, and it's not I'm not using my life instances as grist for the mill in order to to out other people or anything like that. It's all very typical stuff, I thought, and I thought it was just a means. It was also a means to humanize these great figures, who to me were so iconic and large. How do you write about an Augustine? How do you write about a Socrates? How do you write about an Al-Ghazali? And for me, the way to write about it was to make them human. And the way for me to make them human was to imagine myself, basically to utilize sympathetic introspection, to imagine that I'm in their shoes. Not that I know that there's all kinds of methodological problems with that, and I wouldn't pretend ever to be in anyone else's shoes, but to sort of imagine that they're human beings, they had come to a crisis in their own lives, and insofar as I'm human as well, I can try to imagine what those crises were like and to walk through the steps that they took uh, uh, to come to a conclusion. And so that voice made it authentic, or I think it gave the stories a kind of legitimacy that I didn't have academically, that I didn't have by discipline.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, as you say, everything you wrote about your personal life felt very typical. I read it, and I remember I was telling my husband about it, and I was saying, I'm sure, these are the kind of feelings and experiences that many, if not most people, have had some version of. I guess it's that so many of us academics are not used to publishing that material, putting it out there. And some people, I think, want to. I think they want to write more personally or weave that into their academic interests a bit. And so I am wondering if you can tell us a bit how you did that in terms of, did you show it to the family members that you were writing about? For readers who haven't gotten to read Making Peace with the Universe yet, you do talk about your marriage, a bit about your kids. So did they read it first? How did that work?
Yes. So anybody who I mentioned who was living read it first and basically gave the thumbs up. And if you read it, there's nothing lurid in it regarding anybody. So I'm not a novelist that's tearing through friendships in
Right.
order to get it down on
Yeah.
the page. I mean, it's not the it's in a very deep way. It's not the point of the book.
Hmm.
The point of the book is the opposite. The kids were too young. I do have some weird feeling that at some point they'll read it and be like, "Oh, mom and dad were, having troubles at some point," but at that point it'll be 20 years ago, hopefully. And Kathy, my wife, read it and was supportive. Um, and then there were some other folks in the book. The concluding chapter is about a friend who passed away, and I talked to his family, had them read everything. I had his wife, his widow, take a look at it, and had the thumbs up all around. And I wouldn't do it any other way.
Hmm.
I wouldn't do it any other way. And But again, to return to the question of other folks that are interested in writing about themselves or using themselves, for me, sort of judging the gratuitousness of it is it's the hardest part
Mm,
because it's kind of because it's your own story
yeah.
because yeah because it's your own story it's your own story. And I had a real haunting feeling because I had once read a biography of Ronald Reagan. Now I've forgotten the name of the author. It was very good. Maybe it was Morris. I'm not sure, but
Hmm.
he had done a biography of Teddy Roosevelt,
Hmm. Yeah, I think
which
that
was
was right. The
without
Dutch biography, I
the
think.
Dutch
Yeah.
biography. And so Morris had written himself into the story, even though he never knew Reagan. And I remember reading it and thinking to myself, as a writer, I can understand that as an exercise to try to understand where Reagan came from and the cornfields and going to high school in Illinois. I get it. But then I would have cut it all out. Once you found Ronald Reagan through this fiction
Yeah.
of pretending to have known him in his youth, that's a great writerly exercise, but then I didn't think it was helpful to the reader. And so that was something that I struggled with and right now as I'm talking to you, continue to sort of think about regarding this past book. It's like, was it necessary? Was it helpful? Um, and I don't know the answer to that. Some folks may be more exhibitionist than I am, but on the other hand, I'm not concerned that I've disclosed anything because I was scrupulous about talking to everybody who was mentioned.
Oh
So
yeah, no, I mean, and it's not. I don't mean to suggest that at all. It's not. And I'm with those readers of yours who felt like it made the book much more interesting and made me want to turn the pages. So I'm completely in favor of it. And it did make me think of just because I do know a lot of other academics who want to do some of that, and I think people also wonder, won't I feel nervous or uncomfortable about putting this out in the world? Basically, because you were admitting that everything wasn't always perfect, which we know is the case anyway. But so few people are willing to show that to everyone.
it ain't all polka dots and moonbeams, that's for sure. And But on the other hand, there's that line for the beginning of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, which is about happy families are all the same, but miserable families are all different in their own way. And I actually thought that wasn't true. That we have a pretty small gamut of things that go wrong, whether it's financial problems or addictions or illnesses or there's it's kind of like the weather. There's only 5 or 6 or 7 permutations. They can take you by surprise, but there's still, I mean, we're still human beings, and insofar as many of us are in these pair bonding kind of relationships, there's only so many ways that things go. So I didn't feel like anything was being super exposed, and I really left it to the reader to fill in the blanks for
Mm,
themselves. It's like, okay, this fella had these problems. Those are not my particular problems, but I got another set of them,
hmm.
you know.
Yeah. It in terms of it being really readable, as I was reading it, I was thinking, couldn't this have been a trade press book? And was that ever a thought of yours?
That's so I didn't think that way. I mean, I didn't I talked to folks. I mean, I did talk to some agents and I did talk to some publishers and this and that. And I realized pretty quickly that, in fact, although it seems like there would be a market for it or that there is a market for it, spiritual therapy, in fact, it's very denominationally driven.
Mm,
So there's a lot of Christian therapy,
hmm,
or there's a lot of Buddhist. And what I was trying to do was this kind of human spiritual experience across in different cultures and at different times and things. They didn't really know what to do with it.
hmm.
They didn't know that it didn't have, it wasn't obvious as obvious as a trade book as you would think,
Yeah.
or there wasn't an obvious market for it. And so at that point, I said to myself, well, it seems to be the area of my strongest curiosity, so I'm going to finish the thing. And because of the style of it, and it didn't have the apparatus of legitimacy for the Academy as clearly as other books do, with footnotes and sort of intersquabbling regarding, academic debates and things.
Hmm.
There was some difficulty in finding an academic press as well, but I kind of figured, well, either I might self-publish it, or Amazon's terrific, or I didn't have too much of a concern there. And then I figured I'd find some editor that would like it, and I did in Wendy Lochner at Columbia, who got the project. And in the back of my head, I did have an old interview from Spike Lee kind of kicking around, which is he tried to make a movie, one of his best movies called Bamboozled, and he couldn't get any financing for it. He couldn't do anything, but he kept saying, all you need is one green light. That's all you need is one green light. And I figured I'd get a green light, and if I didn't get one, then I would self-publish it and I'd move
Hmm.
on to the next thing.
Yeah, it worked out well. Did your editor at Columbia, did she help you shape it at all?
Uh, yeah, sure.
Mm.
And just helping me with a sense of what was gratuitous and what was not, and
Mm.
what was working and what wasn't, for sure. And she had some personal connection to it, which was very edifying to me. To hear somebody else who was getting something out of the manuscript, and she's published a lot of books in her time, and a lot of them are classics. And so I was just it was very in terms of just sort of moral support. It was Wendy was terrific. Yeah. Also, I don't know why, if this is a tangential point, but the manuscript was 100,000 words,
Hmm.
which I cut down to 60,000 words.
Mm.
So a lot of the gratuitous, I was pretty ruthless in trying to cut it out. Um, and I think that the Wendy didn't go through it with line by line
Hmm.
like that, but I got a sense from her from what was working and what wasn't, and it helped me make those cuts. That's
I
that.
sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
that's just a lot of words to cut. 40,000 words is
Yeah.
practically another book.
Right. So did they wanted a 60,000 word book?
No,
No, okay, just
no,
that's just what you cut. Yeah.
it wanted to be a 60,000 word
Right.
book.
Yeah, I also thought your dialogue was actually really great in it, and it's something that many of us who do academic or nonfiction can't always do well. It made me wonder if you think about fiction or, I mean, screenplay. That's sort of a point in the book itself. But are you thinking of other kinds of writing?
Well, you've worked in screenplays and movies as
I
well.
have not.
Well, I thought Gentleman's Agreement.
Oh, okay, that's true. I do work on Gentleman's Agreement. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, you've looked at plot points
Right.
and three acts and sort of what's going where.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I'd learned it from the Jazz Singer film. I'd
Yeah.
sort of become interested in what is the three act structure. And I do think of three acts in each of the stories that I tell. I do
Mm-hmm.
think of the kind of plot points um, of uh, of a movie. I find it that it's in terms of the length of these particular stories, which each of them are 20 or 30 pages long. Um, it sort of matches the structure of a movie more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does allow a beginning. It shows an inciting moment, an inciting incident, and a kind of a moment when you're all in, where the protagonist is really now has to move forward and figure out their way through this thing, and then some kind of a climactic event, or some kind of a third act in which things really come together. And that was helpful in terms of structuring things, for sure. I do think that way. It's sort of asking yourself, what's the story?
Mm.
Um, and and I do think that the narrative sense that we have as human beings is extremely powerful. And so it's a great mechanism uh, to engage the reader. It's kind of the scaffolding or the skeleton by which the reader turns from page to page to page. And hopefully you're putting on that scaffolding some materials that are edifying or teaching or exploratory or what have you. In this one, so for instance, I really wanted to, I feel like if they're going to read my book, or what I have to write down on the page, I'd better have something to tell them. So for instance, in the chapters that I have on Taoism and Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, um, I use this story about how Genghis Khan basically had a kind of crisis as he was uh, coming to his retirement, and how he started to or take lessons regarding the Tao. So that was the narrative pull of it. But at the bottom of it, what I wanted the reader at the end of it was to understand something about the Tao,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's like the point of it, is to understand something about the spiritual ideas that were gained. And so there is this kind of a balance, or a use of narrative for something more than just narrative. It's not just storytelling,
Mm-hmm.
but it's utilizing the power of storytelling in order to make it a little bit easier, I think, for the reader and for myself, frankly, to power through some of these concepts that are not that easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that worked well. In terms of that desire to make sure the book is page turning, that the reader wants to keep on moving, how did you check for that? Did you have readers, people outside your field, non academics that you were sharing this with?
Occasionally, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would occasionally give it to a friend to take a look at, and if they found it, just to check if it was engaging at all,
Mm-hmm.
because it is, I personally find it very difficult to know whether or not something is just completely meandering, whether this is completely a tangent of my own mind, or whether this train is going anywhere. And so it is, I think, I mean, I wasn't young when I wrote it, but I guess as a developing writer, just to gain the confidence that this thing is going
Mm-hmm.
somewhere, it is helpful to, for me at least, to show it around a little bit. Um, on the other hand, um, one can have a lot of things in their head uh, that make a lot of sense, and if you show it too soon, it's not fair to yourself, because I only showed it around when I had a certain amount of confidence that I think this thing is kind of working. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because you don't want to get shut down. You don't
right.
want to feel like, oh, this thing is just not working.
Yeah, I'm the same way, and I'm a terrible judge of my own writing, and also feel like I have to reach a certain point to be able to share it. It can be hard to find the right people to show it to, but I guess in a way we might be auditioning our readers too. Like, what kind of feedback do I get from this person? Sometimes showing something that's supposed to be a little more engaging to an academic colleague can be difficult because they're expecting another kind of writing. But maybe you had sort of prepped your readers, or they could tell from the story that it was a different kind of book.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, an academic book tends to be very conceptually forward, and although mine was, the goal of it was the conceptions, but it wasn't completely exposed in the beginning. The way that it's structured, I mean, we're getting really in the weeds here, but I guess
It's a
the
writing,
podcast is
yeah.
about writing. It's what it is.
Mhm.
Um, the first chapter is kind of sweeping into the narrative, and it's the frame story of myself and how I
Mhm.
became interested in the project. It's only chapter two where I give the sort of theoretical structure to, like, what's going on here. And in a typical academic book, that would have been chapter one, and there would have been no preface. There would have
Mhm.
been no. Um, so there are things that I did in it that I think turned off some academics and
Mhm.
academic presses, but it's, you know, it was the best that I could do. It was
Mhm.
as simple as I could make it. You know, there's a line from Matthew Arnold that I love so much about style, which is that style is having something to say and saying it as clearly as you possibly can. And
Mhm.
it's like, this is the best that I could do.
Mhm.
I found the voice in which I could say the things that I wanted to say, and I was kind of like, however it lands in the market is how it's going to land.
Yeah. I can't help but think of your first book was such an important book in Jewish studies, and that legacy has lasted. I mean, I remember people have been talking about it for years, and now I don't know, is it almost 25 years old or something?
We don't talk about
Okay,
dates like
whatever.
that.
But just to say that it has continued to be held up as such a model, and so I think I guess I wonder did colleagues and did you think you would do another book like that, or at some point did you think, I'm sort of done with that era or that kind of study?
Um, if there's one thing that I've learned, you try to learn from each
Mhm.
project, and this last one I tried to learn personally from the project. And if there's one thing I really learned, which is that one's curiosity is, I think of it as a gift from God. It's like you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know what your next interest is going to be. Jimi Hendrix didn't, he picked up a guitar when he was 12 years old. He didn't know why. He just thought it was the thing that it was the toy that he needed to play with at that point in time. And that our projects, I mean, I feel very strongly that if we're going to make any kind of a contribution, it's going to be regarding the curiosities that we ourselves are not really in control of. And so I try to be as open as possible to like what these curiosities are taking me. So are they going to return me to something that's more classically Jewish studies in the future? Maybe, probably. I have some ideas. I still love the book Genesis. I still, I'm attracted to materials of spirituality, but I'm also not going to. I feel like we'll never be paid enough to write about things for the sake of the discipline itself. Like
Mm-hmm.
we really need to be, you're spending a lot of time on a manuscript by yourself in a carrel in a library or in an office that's too small or whatever, wherever you are, to be writing about stuff that is not actually driving you personally. But then also the flip side of it, as I said before, is I think that our contributions, if it's going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from those curiosities. So the thing that the book taught me to is that here were these figures, great figures in intellectual life, like Ghazali and I don't talk about Augustine too much, but he was also one of the greats. These were perfectly reasonable people with very big day jobs, and at some point they needed to turn to their spiritual curiosity to get them to the next place. And they decided to say, I'm all in. I don't care if people think it's silly. I'm going to do this. And that's kind of what the next book is about, or the next project is about for me. It's to try to figure out what do I need to be doing next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and life is too short to be writing a book you don't want to be writing. I Some of our guests have talked about how publishing a book has given them confidence to go on to another project, and I'm wondering if this very different second book has made you feel like now you can do X or anything like that.
Well, I'm doing a crazy net. My next project is even further from this. So in college, I had a roommate or a floor mate who went on to become a neurosurgeon who is now involved in some of the first large trials for neurosurgery for major depression. And so I have been following his team, which is based in Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, as they are doing this major 100-person trial for brain implants for major depression. And I mean, talk about not being qualified. I'm not, but again, I've always had some interest in the therapeutic. I've always had some pull to the past as a resource for thought and wisdom. And at the completion of this book, I did start to think to myself, I'd like to understand the here and now and where things are going forward. And so I'm in this middle of this project, which is uh, scary, somewhat scary. It's mostly scary because I'm mostly used to dealing with dead people and things that have happened in the past in which you know what the ending is.
Mm-hmm.
And here I'm in a project in which they don't even know if the trials are going to be successful or not. So dealing with living people but nevertheless, it's, I guess this last book I wrote has been freeing to the idea that you really just got to, whatever the next best project is, whatever the best work I can be doing is, that's where I need to be going.
And has this had any relationship to your teaching? Are you teaching courses at all related to what this next project is?
Well, it's changed my it has had very profound uh, changes in my thinking about religion, for sure, because very strangely, as I was trying to get up to speed regarding 20th and 21st century neurology, became clear to me that I was understanding what was going on because of my understanding of Taoism, which is that in the interpenetration of opposites, that's where reality seems to emerge. To a degree, I mean, that's not all of Taoism, but that's a strong tenet of Taoism is that reality seems to emerge in this strange interpenetration of opposites. And our biology works very much the same way, that our bicep is actually innervated with our tricep. And when one is contracting, the other is not contracting, and the whole body works by the system. And so there were concepts that from religion or from the history of wisdom that have been helpful in thinking about the neurology. And then there were concepts from the neurology that I think have been helpful in thinking about religion, and the most important of which is the concept of rhythmicity. And that if you think about how the body works or just are walking, it's an organization of rhythms repeatedly, in one step moving and the other, and the organization of muscles by a kind of a rhythmic pendulum-like motion backwards and forwards. And that I realized that the something like the sun dance, which is a Native American ritual, is actually the cultivation of rhythmicity, or prayer is the cultivation of rhythmicity, especially when it's done in a group form. And people's brains are literally synchronizing with one another as they're participating in these rituals. And so I started to think about religion as a forum for this I've always thought about it as a forum for the cultivation of affects or feelings, but I never had thought about it in terms of it's actually the cultivation of of group synchronization of rhythms with one person and another. And it may account for to a certain degree to the feeling of being part of something larger than oneself, because literally you are actually creating something larger than yourself as you're synchronizing. So there are ways in which, to me at least, it all holds together. Right now, I'm very much speculating and, sort of talking freestyle, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to get it down on the page
Mm.
with some clarity, more clarity than I was just able to explain it with. But that's kind of what the project is. It's to try to walk through these things with given the knowledge that one has, and to try to take the next step in one understanding, and to try to relay that knowledge to the next, to the next person who may be interested in seeing it themselves.
Something that's come up in our podcast is how, when we're faculty, we don't always have the same kind of colloquium or groups to work through these projects like yours that you're thinking about now. So I'm wondering for you, where you are in your career, who do you show or run this by? How do you figure out, is this working as a book? Am I getting it down on paper in a clear way?
Well, it's hard to find folks. It happens to be that in my own department, I've got a colleague in Buddhism, Matthew King, who's working on the Dalai Lama and
Mm.
neurology.
Mm.
So in my own department, I've got somebody to talk to when we swap manuscripts and things like that. And it happens to be the case that all the neurologists that I've been speaking to about my project, they've all met the Dalai Lama. They're all
Wow.
in conversation. So he's got this great project as well. So you find folks that are out there, and I, I don't know. It's true that you don't necessarily find folks in conferences, um, especially the more idiosyncratic your own work becomes,
Hmm.
I guess. I don't really know. But then also, you're trying to make it, the classroom is helpful because you're just trying to make things as simple as you possibly can in terms of telling it. So if you're not capable of explaining it fairly simply, then you're not doing the job. So that's actually more helpful when you come across somebody that's not necessarily in the field, as
Hmm.
it were.
Yeah, I find that too.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions we've been asking all guests, and one of them is whether there's something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career.
Well, there's something I know now that I wish that I didn't. How about that?
Sure, that would be interesting to hear.
That it never gets easier. It
Hmm.
does not get easier.
Hmm.
It's you're climbing the mountain every single time. The first one that we do, the dissertation, which usually becomes a book, we're dumb enough to think that we can do it. The second one and the third one, you're not so dumb anymore. You realize what the massive effort is involved in doing it. And then it becomes it can become difficult to sit down and say the only way through this is to push through this, that it doesn't get easier. That this is the job. The job is sitting there sometimes with a blank screen or whatever it is for however long it takes and going through very dark points, moments where you think this is just not moving forward and it's never going to move forward. And in fact, I've abandoned projects, so it's not unrealistic. It's not, it's, um, and rightly, I think I've abandoned projects. So, um, yeah, that the struggle never ends. So that's something that I wish I didn't know.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, the thing that I guess I wish I did know is something that I discovered in the writing, which is that your curiosity is not frivolous. That whatever it is that's of interest to you, that I don't know if you can assume that other people in the world will be interested in it, but I think that you have to make that uh, as a kind of a premise that whatever one's curiosity is, that is where one will make their contribution. You can't make a contribution more than in the things that drive you to ask the questions that are the questions that you need to ask for yourself. And to take those seriously, I think, even though they may outwardly seem like, oh, there's no market for it, which was the case in my last book. It turned out that I thought that there might be a larger market for it, but they didn't, the way that the market was divided, it wasn't exactly there. It was not a book in Christian theology or Buddhist theology, or not theology, excuse me, therapy, Christian therapy or Buddhist therapy. It was this universal thing that didn't have a natural market, but I still sort of inspired by the figures that I was reading about, that they had pushed through their curiosities, even though it seemed stupid to them initially, allowed me to push forward. And that's a bit of advice that I think it would be nice to have a little bit earlier on. The market is less important than you think.
Yeah. The other question we've been asking folks is whether there's a writing habit or practice that works for you.
Uh, yeah. Uh, for me, it's as often as possible to keep the morning hours sacrosanct. And that means writing, not researching.
Hmm.
Meaning, I try I try to put my own words down or organize my own thoughts in the hours between 8 and noon or something like that. At some point, I read, and it may not be true, but at some point, I read that violinists practice for 90 minutes and then take a break.
Hmm.
And so that's what I do. I set a timer for 90 minutes, take a break, do another 90 minutes, at which point I feel like, okay, something got accomplished today. And then if I'm capable, I'll do a third or fourth 90 minutes. But I'm reminded of something that I read recently about what Philip Roth would ask people on the telephone, fellow writers that he was sort of mentoring. He would ask them, "Have you written today?"
Mm.
And if the answer was yes, he would be good. Then you did your job.
Right.
And so I think that that's true. I think that that's right. That basically, it's hard when you're teaching and you got a morning class, whatever. But on days that I don't have a morning class, I am trying to work at least 90 minutes a day. And if you can do two of those for 5 days a week, I'm always shocked at what I'm able to put out.
Hmm.
And I do, and that for me, the 90 minutes is that I feel like it's long enough to do something.
Hmm.
Sometimes I feel like if it's just an hour, I can't get my head focused enough to feel like I'm going to accomplish something in this period of time. So for me, that 90 minutes it's a nice thing. I feel like something can definitely happen in this period of time. It's not too short. But other folks, use 20 minutes or whatever. It depends on your own rhythm. Some people work at night. Some people, there's all kinds of ways. Yeah.
Well,
How about, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Am I allowed to ask you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm also morning. I have a lot of trouble with the having perspective on my own writing. So of course, everyone, you want to print out your stuff, or at least that's one way. If I see it printed, I sort of have a different perspective. I also do the thing of changing fonts. That
Yeah.
also helps me see it anew. Yeah, I mean, it's always feel like giving myself the gift of having some time away from it, because the next day I always see it sort of different. So I used to kind of procrastinate much more on things, and now I'm just like, all right, let me give myself more days when I can come to this fresh, because I just find that really hard to see my to see my writing like an outside reader. Um, and I was also kind of late to the game of even sharing my work. I mean, now I realize how incredibly helpful that is. Nobody seems to really write on their own. I mean, when I talk to so many of my colleagues, it turns out they're showing it to all sorts of people, and that feedback has really made it what it is. So that's changed things a ton, that I actually do that now, which I didn't used to do.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of like one's tastes in food. They can actually change over time. So, you develop and things, and maybe for some projects you share and for other projects you don't share. There's no, there's no rules.
Right.
Yeah, and there's in a sense there's no teaching it either. I mean,
Mm,
you're basically teaching yourself.
that is very true. Yeah.
But your font trick, I do that too. It's like trying to trick yourself into as though somebody else has written it. It doesn't
Yeah.
exactly work, but it works just enough to help you move forward.
Yeah. I'm also, I guess I read my stuff aloud. That's another one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, just because I suppose I like to imagine it as an audible type of thing, in that I want it to actually read kind of well. Unlike, say, an academic journal article, which I don't have that kind of aspiration for it, but something that's going to be a book or a popular piece, I feel like I should be able to hear it a little.
Yep, and recording it also,
Mm.
and then listening to it, and then deciding whether because I do find in that process that you're describing, you can simplify
Mm-hmm.
that what is more complicated on the page, spoken actually can be abstracted just a little bit more. So
Definitely.
listening to it helps in that abstraction process, I think.
Agreed.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you for thinking of me. Thank you for a great podcast. I have been listening up. Now I'm now a long time listener, but a first time caller.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod, and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.